who is Manawydan? We know he's one of the most significant characters in the 4 branches of the Mabinogi. His story is told in the 3rd branch. And we can see that Manawydan, fab Llyr, is a very similar name to the Irish Manannán Maclir. What is the relationship between Manawydan and the Manannán? How does Manawydan, the Welsh character, relate to the broader Celtic tradition? What are his roots? Now, these are some very difficult questions that Celtic scholars have been seeking to answer for some time now. Of course, in this series, we're looking at the work of W.J. Griffith initially, his 1953 classic, Rhiannon, which looks at the 1st and 3rd branches. But of course, I'm also using W.J. Griffith's work on Rhiannon as a springboard to look at the broader tradition of Celtic scholarship in the 20th century. And this session is going to be no different. I'm going to be beginning with W.J. Griffith and what he says about Manawydan and how he relates to Manannán Maclir, and then looking at the work of some Celtic scholars that came after him and their opinion on what's going on. Now, so far, we've seen how Griffith's work, Rhiannon, although relatively well received at the time, in the 50s, by today, it's kind of gone out of fashion. We've seen in early episodes of this series how he collected an amazing amount of data but came to some rather confused conclusions about all that information and data that he gathered. But in this session, we're going to look at how W.J. Griffith sets out an idea, how it goes out of fashion, and then how later scholars have actually come back to agree with him once again. So the pendulum has swung back in his favour, let's say. His work on Manawydan is actually very informative. He does make some really interesting comparisons between Manawydan and Manannán Maclir, as we've already seen earlier on in this series. But fundamentally, as always, W.J. Griffith sees that the Welsh storytellers borrowed from the Irish. This is what he has to say. Perhaps the strangest feature of the Mabinogi of Manawydan is the character of Manawydan himself and the role assigned to him. Taking the older Celtic tradition as a whole, both Irish and Welsh, we may safely assert that no character in this vast pantheon is so clearly defined as that of Manannán Manawydan. In Irish legend, Manannán is always the magician, and from the paucity of references to Manawydan in Welsh legends, and from the complete misrepresentation of his traditional character in what is practically the only account of him in Welsh, that is the 3rd branch of the Mabinogi, we may safely conclude that his name has been lifted from Irish merely as a name and applied to a character developed exclusively in Welsh story and literature, having no correspondence to his clearly defined personality in Irish. And of course, W.J. Griffith is right to agree, saying that there's a significant body of text discussing and describing the narratives associated with Manannán Maclir in Irish literature, and we've only really got one significant story concerning Manawydan in Welsh literature. We've got a few other references in some poems, but not much. Now, I disagree with W.J. Griffith here, and even though some later scholars, Celtic scholars working today, tend to agree with W.J. Griffith's opinion here, I'm going to disagree with them also, because I think that there is at least a hint of an older mythology behind both Manawydan in the Welsh tradition and the Manannán Maclir in the Irish. I think that we can at least hypothesize a connection. That's not to say that we've got much evidence to do it, but I think that there are some common themes and elements that we find in their respective stories. But we'll come to that later on in the session. To begin with, let's talk through, in very brief and simple terms, what the Celtic scholars of the 20th century had to say with regards to Manawydan and Manannán Maclir. Now, one of the first to sort of approach this matter after W.J. Griffith was, of course, the great Celtic scholar Rachel Bromwich. Rachel Bromwich, who gave us Trioedd Ynys Prydain, the Triads of the Islands of Britain, and great editions such as Culhwch and Olwen. So she's definitely one of the more important Celtic scholars of the 20th century. And I'm hoping in future to actually do a series on her work, because it's fascinating stuff, especially the Triads, but that's to come in the future. For now, let's stick to what she has to say about the matter of Manawydan and how he relates to Manannán mac Lir. So she begins by saying, the name of Manawydan is evidently related to the territorial name Manaw, applied in early times both to the Isle of Man and to the region of Manaw-Gododdin, which lay along the southern shore of the Firth and Forth. I'll show you where that is. So if you can see Gododdin, that's the ancient Welsh kingdom of the Gododdin tribe, who were around the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, just about. And if you can just see to the left of the name Gododdin, you'll see an area called Manaw-Gododdin, which was pretty much in the northwestern corner of the Gododdin kingdom. So Manaw, either in the name Manawydan, either comes from Manaw-Gododdin, or perhaps even from the Isle of Man. And of course, on this map here, which is a map of the north of England and southern Scotland and just a little bit of Northern Ireland on the left there, you'll see the island, the little island on the bottom left of the image, that's the Isle of Man. So either Manawydan, his name derives from Manaw-Gododdin or the Isle of Man. And we're going to consider both options here. So go back to Rachel Bromwich. And in the middle of the paragraph now, and whatever the origin of the relationship, the Welsh Manawydan undoubtedly corresponds with the Irish sea god Manannán mac Lir. Okay, we've covered this already, but this is the interesting thing here. Who in euhemerized form, euhemeresis, is when a historical person, individual, turns into a mythological figure, into a god. So Rachel Bromwich thinks that there's evidence that Manannán mac Lir, or Manawydan, whoever the original person was actually a historical person who becomes a god later in Celtic tradition. And that's because of this quote, which is found in an Irish text called Cormac's Glossary, which was created around the 900s. And this is what Cormac's Glossary tells us. Manannán was a celebrated merchant who was in the Isle of Man. He was the best pilot that was in the west of Europe. He used to know by studying the heavens, that is, using the sky, the period which would be fine weather and the bad weather, and when each of these two times would change. Hence, the Scots and Britons, i.e. the early Welsh, called him a god of the sea, and hence they said he was son of the sea, i.e. mac Lir, which is Gaelic or Irish for son of the sea. So very interesting. Here we have Cormac's Glossary essentially describing the process of euhemerization, historic real person, through legend turning into a mythological figure. Everything looks pretty fine so far, yeah? And we can say that that kind of works out because Manannán mac Lir is very closely associated with the sea in the Irish tradition. We need only think of stories such as Imran Bran, the Voyage of Bran. He's also closely associated with the sea in the Manx tradition also, the tradition of the Isle of Man, but we'll come to that in a moment. So far so good, yeah? This could be a reasonable explanation for what's going on, and this is pretty much what Rachel Bromwich is proposing. She does go on, though. She's got a little bit more to say about her favourite theory. The exact nature of the relation between Manannán mac Lir and Manawydan fab Llŷr is difficult to ascertain, but as you can see from the similarity between the two names, there's definitely some type of relationship. The most acceptable explanation, to Rachel Bromwich, the most reasonable she assumes, is perhaps that offered by Vindich. Can't read German, unfortunately, but we'll take Rachel Bromwich's word for it. Now, Vindich claimed that both Irish and Welsh forms were derived independently from the place name, Welsh Manaw, and Irish Mana or Manu. But that's whereas the Welsh Manawydan is based on the nominative case, that is, it's the case that gives us a standard name, it's the subject of a sentence, yeah? Manannán is derived from the Irish stem Manu. We can compare the surviving Scottish place names, Clackmannan, Slamanan, which preserve the genitive case, that is, which gives us the possessive sense of a word, yeah? I'm assuming what that means here is that Manannán means the person from Manu, Manannán being the person who belongs to Manu in a way, the genitive case. If this explanation is correct, Manawydan, Manannán, can be regarded as a deity known from early times in both Ireland and Wales. So Rachel Bromwich's preferred explanation is not just that this was a man who turns into a god and is then believed in as a sea god by both the Welsh and the Irish and the Scottish Gaelic folks up in Scotland, but also that their respective names, Manannán mac Lir and Manawydan, are essentially just different evolutions, different types of name derived from the place name, Isle of Man or Manaw Gododdin. Pretty straightforward, yeah? Well, you'd think so, but actually, later scholars, such as Patrick Sims-Williams, disagree with this. They don't think that this is the case. And Patrick Sims-Williams is, an important figure in Celtic scholarship today. He's an editor of an important journal. He's written a really fantastic book called Irish Influence on Medieval Welsh Literature, which is an amazing source book. So he knows what he's talking about, so we should pay attention to what he says. And in his book, Irish Influence on Medieval Welsh Literature, he has this to say. It is simpler to regard Manawydan as a Welsh adaptation of the Irish name, altered so as to connect it clearly with Manaw, the Welsh equivalent of Irish Manannán. That the form is Manawydan rather than something like Manawan may be due to contamination with the word Manawyd. Now, let's just be careful here. Patrick Sims-Williams is essentially agreeing with W.J. Griffith that Manawydan is borrowed from the Irish Manannán, and he believes that it turns into Manawydan instead of something that sounds a bit more like Manannán, like Manawan, because of the influence of the Welsh word Manawyd or Manawyd, which essentially means an awl. It's a shoemaker's tool. Manawyd makes holes in leather before they're stitched, yeah? Now this is interesting for us because of course Manawydan is one of the great shoemakers of the Welsh tradition. That's how he earns his living in Hereford. He's so good at making shoes that he's sort of run out of town because he's putting all the other shoemakers out to business. So it's interesting that this is part of his name, and this could be one of the images or properties of the character that's evoked in the story by the storytellers. Manawydan looks like Manawyd. He's obviously a shoemaker. That's probably what his name means, perhaps in the medieval Welsh tradition. That is not so early in the Celtic tradition when this character is evolving. And here he refers specifically to W.J. Griffith. It is also possible, though not essential, to suppose with W.J. Griffith that an old Irish spelling, Manannán, in which ND was merely a conventional spelling of N, Patrick Sims-Williams is describing here how an old Irish spelling of Manannán could turn into Manawydan, and how in many ways this is a relatively safe theory, that this is the simplest theory and therefore the most likely. Of course, many scholars, many people in academia like to see simple reasons and often assume that the simplest reason is the most likely. So, okay, all very interesting. We've got W.J. Griffith beginning back in 1953 saying Manawydan is just borrowed from the Irish Manannán. Then Rachel Bromwich agreeing with another German scholar in this case, saying, no, it's more likely that this was actually a god believed in by both the Irish and the Welsh, and it's just that their names evolved slightly differently from the same place name, that being the Isle of Man, or Manawydan. And then Patrick Sims-Williams saying, no, I actually agree with W.J. Griffith. It is more likely that Manawydan is nicked from the Irish tradition, fundamentally, and that we have also this influence of the Manawyd, coming in to change this Irish name slightly. Now, me personally, and this is just my opinion, I think they're all wrong. I think that Manawydan and Manannán mac Lir could have evolved from an ancient archetype, an ancient mythological figure in the Celtic tradition that evolves into both Manannán mac Lir and Manawydan fab Llŷr in both the Irish and the Welsh traditions respectively. I think there could be an older mythological figure that sits behind both of these characters. And the reason I say that is because I don't just think it's their names that are similar. I think there are a few common themes in the characters of Manannán mac Lir and Manawydan fab Llŷr, but also in the Isle of Man version of this character, who is called Manannán beg mac Lir. And Manannán beg is effectively an evolved form of Manannán mac Lir. But this evolved form of Manannán mac Lir could also contain some of the older aspects of this, what I'm assuming to be an ancient archetype in the Celtic tradition. Now, just to be clear, Manx is a Q Celtic language, so it's much closer to Irish Gaelic, and in many ways it is a derived language. It comes from Irish Gaelic in many ways, although some people claim there are some P-Celtic or Brythonic elements in the Manx language also, but that's another conversation. So Manannán beg is almost certainly related or even derived in many ways from the Irish Manannán mac Lir. But those traditions could also preserve some of the older archetype that have lasted longer in the Isle of Man and have evolved differently in Ireland. Yeah? Let's take a look at the similarities between all of these different characters, shall we? W.J. Griffith, actually earlier on in his study Rhiannon, tells us something very interesting about Manannán mac Lir. We've covered this already, but it's worth reminding you what W.J. Griffith had to say. This is, of course, talking about the story of the conception of Mongan, one of the great hero kings of the Irish tradition. Now, Manannán mac Lir offered help to Fiachna to defeat his enemy, who was, of course, Manannán himself. If you can remember that deception in the story, Manannán sets up a war between Fiachna and his disguised self, so Manannán mac Lir is actually the enemy, and Manannán tricks Fiachna to attack this strange enemy up in the north so that he can set up this situation where he can effectively sleep with Fiachna's wife. He offered to help Fiachna to defeat his enemy, who was of course Manannán himself, for a consideration, namely that they should change forms and that Manannán should go to Ireland to Fiachna's court in Fiachna's form and sleep with Fiachna's wife. He said, I shall go there in thy shape, so that thy wife shall not be defiled by it. So I'll change my form and appearance, and I'll go and sleep with your wife, so that she's not defiled by me sleeping with her. She'll just think it's you. So it was agreed, and Fiachna, in Manannán's form, was able to conquer his enemy and seize the kingship of Lochlan. So Manannán is a magic being, so he can lose the fight up in the north, but he can also sleep with Fiachna's wife. At the same time, Fiachna's wife became pregnant by Manannán in Fiachna's form. And in another story, in the Voyage of Bran, we see Manannán describing the son that he wants to have with Fiachna's wife. He will delight the company of every she, so every fairy mound. He will be the darling of every goodly land. He will make known secrets, a course of wisdom in the world without being feared. So his son is going to be a great man, effectively. Manannán mac Lir wants to create a great king. And in other stories, we see how Manannán mac Lir is effectively someone who wants to test kings, as in the adventures of Cormac, for example. There's a sense that he's testing Cormac the king to find out if he is a man of integrity, if he can tell the truth, for example, if he's worthy of the kingship of Ireland, is what's being implied in that story. And here we see that Manannán mac Lir wants to found a great lineage. He wants to have a great king as a son. So Manannán mac Lir is connected with the theme of good kingship. He wants perfect kings in the mortal realm. He is, of course, in many ways one of the Tuatha Dé Danann, so he's one of the immortal folk. So it's not right for him to sit on a mortal throne, is one way we could see it. But he wants to influence the kingship of the mortal realm. He wants to influence the culture of kingship in Ireland. He wants good kings. Now this is interesting because this is very similar to what we find in the Manx tradition. In Manx folklore, we hear this. He, Manannán Beg, the Manx version of Manannán mac Lir, was a mild ruler. He was a fair, mild, gentle ruler, yeah? The tribute that he exacted from his followers, that is, the tax he raised on his subjects, was a bart, a measure of liacha glass, green sedge. So he wasn't asking his subjects for money or any produce other than an abundantly growing weed, basically, a plant that was everywhere, this green sedge. He was a gentle, mild ruler. He was a good king. He didn't act as some type of parasite, sucking the populace dry so that he could increase his own wealth. He's a good king, yeah? The word liacha is Manx for a person who deserved to be rewarded. Manannán Beg acquired the name liacha on account of being a person who deserved to be rewarded. He was worthy of being the king of the Isle of Man. So, like Manannán mac Lir in Ireland, Manannán Beg on the Isle of Man is also connected with this idea of a good king. Now it's different. Manannán mac Lir himself isn't the good king in the Irish tradition. It's his son, Mongan, his children, and also the kings, the mortal kings that he tests, that he kind of initiates. These are his good kings in Ireland, but on the Isle of Man, it's Manannán Beg himself who's the good king. Now, how does this compare to Manawydan in the Welsh tradition? Well, we can see that Manawydan in the third branch, as those of you who are sitting the Four Branches course will know at the moment, Manawydan in many ways is the great hero of the Four Branches. He is the most successful king. He succeeds in rescuing the whole kingdom of Dyfed from the enchanted mist. He succeeds in rescuing Rhiannon, his partner, and his friend Pryderi from the enchanted castle. And he does all of this without even raising a sword. In the story itself, without even killing a mouse. He can achieve these great feats by doing very, very little. And in the Welsh triads, we hear how Manawydan is one of the great humble kings of Britain. He cannot be denied a kingdom, even though he doesn't seek it for himself, which is a very interesting thing to say, yeah? He may not be looking for power, but people can't help but give him power because of his own personal virtue. He's a perfected king in that sense, yeah? So we can see in the figure of Manannán mac Lir, Manannán Beg mac Liacha, and Manawydan, we've got this very obvious theme of the perfected king. The best man for the job. Who should be in charge? That's essentially what's being explored in all of these different variations of what I believe is a very ancient character. Now, of course, there is another connection, that being mist. Manannán mac Lir in the Irish tradition can summon a mist, and it's an enchanted otherworldly mist. For example, in the story of Cormac, Cormac must pass through this mist so as to reach the otherworld, to find his wife and children. In the folklore concerning Manannán Beg on the Isle of Man, he is a king, a godlike king, who can protect the island by shrouding it in mist. This is part of the folklore of the Isle of Man. Manannán Beg protects the island as a good king by shrouding it in mist. Now, of course, in the third branch of the Mabinogi, Manawydan doesn't summon the mist himself. He is the victim of the enchanted mist. But we can still see how mist is an important, a crucial part of his story. Yeah? So I would say there's enough there to see that it's not just about the names. It's not just about the similarities of the names and what the names tell us about the different evolutions of this, I would say, more ancient mythological character in these separate traditions. I would say that there's something far more going on. Now, neither do we have enough data, enough evidence. We don't really have enough sources to back my argument up. But I still think that there's something more going on. I still would rather believe that Manawydan and Manannán mac Lir and Manannán Beg are all evolved versions of an older figure, a figure that they all inherited from the more ancient Celtic tradition of roughly 3,000 years ago.